I have this mini here to finish today, and I'm going to face it. It's a clean, modern way to finish your quilt, and I'm going to show you how, step by step, right now. So you'll need a few things. You'll need some fabric that matches your quilt, preferably the background color of your quilt, or if you have a border on your quilt, the color of the border. Now, I don't have this exact green anymore, so I chose a color that is pretty close. Ideally, you will not be able to see any of this from the front, but sometimes a little bit can poke out. So this is as close as I can get for this mini. You'll also need a rotary cutter and a ruler and an iron and hand sewing supplies. First thing I'm going to do is press my fabric, and then we are going to cut 2-inch strips. And you will need a 2-inch strip for each side of your quilt. Now, this is a tiny little 16-inch mini quilt, so I'll be able to do that in one segment on each side, even from this fat quarter. If you are facing a large quilt, then you may need to piece them together. So let's press this fabric and cut some strips. Now 2 inches is flexible. If you already have some 2 1/4 or 2.5 inch strips cut for binding and you want to change to facing, then by all means use those. Don't bother cutting them down or anything. They will work perfectly. But 2 inches is a nice comfortable size to work with. Now that we have our strips cut, it is back to the ironing board. Now, instead of pressing them in half like you normally would, we are just going to press down about 1/4 inch of one side of each of these strips. All my strips are pressed. Now, they're not all perfect. I didn't measure. An eyeballed 1/4 inch or so is just fine, as long as you have a nice, clean, folded edge to work with. Now you're going to need your quilt, and we're going to sew the first side down. We are not going to sew these strips together unless you need to piece it to do a side. We're going to be doing each side individually. So lay your strip with the fold up and showing. This is right sides together with your quilt top. If you would like to pin, you certainly can. I'm going to just stick a couple of clips on here to hold it in place. And now we are going to sew from end to end. You can kind of feel the start and end of your quilt top here. You're going to sew with 1/4 inch all the way along that side. Now, your thread will not be visible on the front of your quilt once we're finished with this, but it will be visible on the back. It will show on this binding facing strip that we're attaching. So I'm going to go ahead and switch out to matching color, top and bobbin, and that will just give it a little bit of a cleaner look, but it's not absolutely necessary. If the back of your quilt does not matter to you, then use whatever thread you have loaded already. Okay, we have our first strip attached. I did not use a walking foot. You certainly could if you like to use a walking foot while working on your quilt sandwich. I know that this is densely quilted. I'm not worried about the layer shifting, but what I did do was I took a little bit of a longer stitch than I normally do, and I decreased the presser foot pressure. It's not a pressure foot, it's a presser foot. I decreased the pressure on the presser foot so that it wasn't creating a lot of drag on my quilt. So now we have this kind of odd looking arrangement. Just one side is dealt with. Now we are going to take this over to our iron, and we are going to press this out. So while pressing, make sure you are mindful of that initial pressed fold that we put into this piece, because we do still need that. One step closer. Now we're going to use a clothing technique called understitching to help us flatten this line here. Eventually this will be turned, this whole thing will be turned to the back of the quilt to give us a nice clean edge. To make that turn a little bit easier, we are going to add a line of stitching on the facing strip, but still within the seam allowance so that we're going through our quilt sandwich. If you have one of those special feet for your machine that allows you to place a line of stitching, like a stitch in the ditch or a stitch right next to the ditch foot, then this is a great time to use this. I don't have one for my machine, so I am just going to try to get a line of stitching right centered in that 1/4 of an inch of my quilt sandwich that's currently covered by that facing strip. So since I swapped out to matching thread, this is not entirely visible, but I just have a line of stitching right next to the edge of where I sewed that facing strip on. So now before I go to my ironing board, I like to kind of pre-roll this to the back of the quilt and give it a nice little pinch so that I am sure that what I want to be shown on the front is on the front and the rest is on the back. Just giving it a little finger press. Because we have understitched it, it will roll and fold quite nicely. So we're just going to give it a little help, make sure everything is where we want it, and then we will go over to our ironing surface and do this from the back, making sure that the facing strip is nice and flat, including that initial fold that we pressed into it. While it is still warm, I like to put some clips on it to hold that flat and get that seam as flat as possible. And I like to make sure that the flat portion of the clip is on the back of the quilt where I really want it to be nice and flat. Now you can repeat these steps on the alternate side and only the alternate side of your quilt. We need to have these 2 sides finished before we can move on to the final 2 sides. So you can do the same thing here, get it to the clip stage, and then it's time to hand stitch. I am using contrasting thread, black thread, so that you guys can more easily see it. I normally would choose a thread that was either gray or green to blend a little bit more with my facing, but black today. The needle I'm using is a Clover Gold Eye needle, and I like this, and I like Milliner size 9s for hand stitching. But find whatever needle feels comfortable in your hand and that you enjoy using. Now we are going to stitch from one side all the way across, just tacking this folded edge that we initially pressed into our fabric strip down to the back of the quilt. I like to work at a table so that the weight of the quilt is supported, and then I can just tuck my hand under this edge and I can use my fingers on the right side of the quilt to feel if my needle is going all the way through, because I don't want this thread to show on the front of my quilt. So I'm going to be stitching through the sandwich, but only through the backing and a little bit of the batting. I don't want to go all the way through. So having my hand under my work will let me know if I'm poking myself and going through the whole quilt sandwich. So we still have these flaps from where our strips were cut with plenty of size for the edges of our quilt. I'm going to just ignore them for now. I'm going to get them stitched down and secured, and then we will clip them off. I'm going to start by folding the edge of my facing back, and I do have a knot in the end of my thread. So I am going to put my needle through just the backing and a little bit of the batting and pull it through. This knot I'm just going to leave here. I'm actually going to take a little double stitch just to secure it, because when we fold this back, you'll never see it. And then from the underside, I'm going to come up just on the very fold of that facing strip. And then I am going to sew across by putting my needle down into the backing, and my finger is right under where I am putting my needle down. I'm putting my needle down right above where my thread comes up, traveling in the quilt sandwich a bit, and then I'm coming out in the fold of that facing strip again, about 1/4 of an inch away. I generally take a little bit bigger stitches when I'm sewing a facing down, mostly because I use facings for wall hangings or things that aren't going to get a lot of wear and tear. So these aren't, they don't feel like as structural as stitches as binding. But I'm going to just repeat that all the way across. And that is all there is. You can remove the clips as you come to them if that will help you get a good grip. but you just want to make sure your facing is nice and flat, and take a stitch through the sandwich and come up in the fold. Now, even though I'm using contrasting thread here, these stitches are really fairly invisible. So don't stress too much about the size or consistency, because if you take small stitches from the fold into the quilt sandwich, then it'll be a fairly invisible stitch. If you come to the end of your thread, let's say I only had a little bit left, I like to stop when I have a couple of inches left so that I have enough to tie off. So let's say I was down to this much thread. What I would do is fold back a little bit of the facing here, and then I would take a stitch in the backing to kind of travel down below where that fold will be, and take a small stitch and run my thread through that loop and pull it. And then I like to take this tail and just take a couple of big long stitches just to hold it securely in here so that it's not kind of flapping up where I'm trying to work. And then I cut the excess off, and now that will all be hidden. To start a new thread to pick up where we left off, we're going to tie a knot in our thread. Any knot will do. I do the little roll it over your fingers technique, but if you have a better knot you would like to use. So I'm going to fold our facing strip back, and this is a little bit awkward, you're going to stitch kind of towards yourself just through the batting and backing, and I'm going to come up in the backing where I left off with that final stitch. And then I can fold my facing strip back down, and then I like to come up through the facing, and then I'm back to where I was. Down through the backing, up through the facing, all the way across. We have our two alternate sides stitched down, and you can see my hand stitching is slightly visible even with that black thread, but it didn't come through to the front at all, so we are good to go. We have two more sides to attach, but first we need to trim our little excess flaps. I like to wait until this point to do it. I suppose you could do it earlier if it's really important to you for some reason, but I like having it securely in place, and then I can just, from the front, take a pair of scissors and clip it off even with the edge of the quilt. So now we have just the two final raw edges of our quilt sandwich, and you can see our quilt batting is still poking out in there. Now, most of the process for this will be exactly the same as it was for the first two sides. You're going to take your strip, you're going to sew it right sides together with your quilt sandwich with a 1/4 inch seam, press it out, and add that understitching to the facing and seam allowance to flatten it and help you turn it. And then you're going to press it to the back side, just like this, but pause before we get to the hand stitching and don't trim off these edges, because we will be hand stitching things a little bit differently for these final two steps. We are all clipped and ready to hand stitch. Now we need to deal with these flaps that are hanging out from the edge of our quilt. We can't just cut them off like we did on the first two strips, because then we would have raw edges at the corners, and that's no good. It won't be durable, and it won't, it'll just fray and won't hold up over time. So when we begin stitching our facing strips down for these final two sides, we need to fold the strip, kind of tuck it behind itself. So I'm going to undo these clips, and I'm going to unfold it, and I'm going to take this edge and I'm just going to tuck it so that it turns like back on itself. And you want this line to be fairly continuous, because we're now going to fold that back up. You can do what you need to do to fuss around with it, but the important things to focus on right now are this edge and this corner. And then I'm going to put my clips back on here to hold it. Now the flap is sticking up a little bit beyond our facing strip, so I'm just going to take a little fold and kind of jam it under that facing strip. And that's it. There's a little bit of a bulk of fabric under here, but it will be contained within the facing strip because now we're going to sew from this point all the way to the other edge. And before we get to this edge over here, we are going to do that folding and tucking thing again, so that in the end, we will have all finished edges on the outside of our faced quilt. A little time hand sewing and it is done. My quilt is completely faced. I went ahead and finished that final side so that you could see it all done. And here's what it looks like from the front. You can see the lines of quilting just kind of wrap around the edges and create a nice clean canvas. It looks a little bit more like a piece of art stretched on a canvas rather than a quilt that would have that binding border around it. From the back, it looks okay. The corners here are a little bulky and messy, but that's on the back. There are, like binding, many different ways to face a quilt. There are some where you sew the strips together first and then turn them to the back. I have had better luck with getting these nice 90-degree corners when I do the facing strips separately like we did here. So I hope you guys enjoyed this little facing tutorial and you found it helpful. If you are going to be entering a quilt in a show, then maybe it'll help you out. Until we meet again with another quilting video, I hope you guys have a lovely time and happy quilting!